What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into my starts and sits for week 3 of the 2022 fantasy football season at the tight end position. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel, and drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, Thursday Night Football, we've got the Steelers at the Browns. I am starting Pat Freiermuth all day long. He has looked very, very good through his first 2 games this season. He's had over 12 fantasy points in week 1 and in week 2, and at least 7 targets, 1 score on the season, 75 receiving yards in week 1. I love everything we've seen out of Pat Freiermuth. Even if the Steelers offense doesn't look great, at least we can rely on his chemistry with Mitchell Trubisky at the moment. I think even if Kenny Pickett does take over, Pat Freiermuth is going to continue to be relevant. So I like him in this matchup against the Browns. On the other hand, we've got David Njoku, who had a better, decent fantasy day week 2 in comparison to week 1 at 6.2 fantasy points in comparison to 1.7 in week 1. But overall still not good enough to make him a start even in full PPR scoring format. So I'll leave him as a sit moving into week 3. All right, the Bills at Dolphins. We've got 2 tight ends who kind of redeemed themselves in comparison looking at week 1 versus week 2. Let's start with Dawson Knox, who had 8.1 fantasy points in week 2, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 41 receiving yards, a much better stat line overall than what we saw in week 1, where he had 1.5 fantasy points. So I don't think the ceiling is necessarily crazy high for Dawson Knox in this game, but I do like this matchup and game script overall. Although I do think both defenses are good, I do think towards the end of this football game you could really see both offenses start to come out. So I really do actually like Mike Gesicki, who in week 1 had just 1.1 fantasy points, and in week 2 the shootout with Baltimore ended up with 14.1 fantasy points, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 41 receiving yards, and a score. A really good stat line overall. So yes, Buffalo's defense is quite good. The Dolphins defense is not playing bad either if you take away the shootout against Baltimore. So overall, I like Gesicki, I like Dawson Knox in this matchup. If you don't have better options, I think either tight end within this matchup is just fine moving into week 3. All right, Bengals at Jets. I've got Hayden Hurst of the Cincinnati Bengals and Tyler Conklin of the New York Jets, both as sits, but I do think they're okay streaming options if you're in a bad enough position. Hayden Hurst, 7.4 fantasy points in week 2 and 9.6 in week 1. He's definitely getting enough targets to put him in the conversation as a decent streamer on the week, like I said. And Tyler Conklin, on the other hand, 9 points in week 2, 10.6 in week 1. Joe Flacco is definitely targeting our guy Conklin. So like I said, he's a good enough streaming option. The matchup's not too bad overall for either Hurst or Conklin, but I think for a majority of fantasy owners moving into week 3, they're going to be sits. All right, Raiders at Titans. I've got Darren Waller as a start. I really do like Waller in this matchup. The Titans look god-awful all around. That team looks abysmal. Darren Waller's 11.9 fantasy points in week 1, 17 points in week 2, at least 6 targets through each game, at least 50 receiving yards through each game, and has 1 score on the season. So Waller is returning that value in terms of where you drafted him overall at the moment. Austin Hooper, on the other hand, like I said, this Titans offense, an absolute mess. The team as a whole, an absolute mess. He's going to be a sit for me moving into week 3. All right, Saints at Panthers. I'm not confident enough to start either Taysom Hill or Jerome Johnson. I do think that Johnson is actually kind of an interesting option. I mean, he had 8 fantasy points in week 2, 6.3 in week 1, at least 5 targets in each game. I think in deeper leagues you could consider Johnson, but majority of you guys aren't going to need to do so. Taysom Hill, just way too volatile, 15 points in week 1, 1.4 points in week 2, so that certainly did not work out. In terms of the Panthers, there's not a viable starter at the tight end position at this point in time, so you don't need to worry about even thinking about starting a Panthers tight end moving into week 3. All right, Ravens at Patriots. You know you're starting Mark Andrews if you own him. Some fantasy managers disappointed with his week 1 stat line, but come on, he still got you 10 fantasy points in full PPR in week 2 in the shootout. Miami, 25.7 fantasy points, 11 targets, 9 receptions, 104 receiving yards, and a score. Those are the type of stat lines we want as Mark Andrews owners. Is he going to repeat that against New England? Probably not, but he's still going to get you somewhere between 10 and 25 fantasy points. You're starting Mark Andrews. There's really no debate about it. Don't get crazy, right? Hunter Henry on the other end has been very, very, very disappointing in my eyes. I really thought he was going to continue to be a good late round value. At the moment, so far in the season, he has a total of 4 fantasy points in full PPR, and that is all from week 1. He had 0 fantasy points in week 2, 1 target, no receptions. He was only on the field for 50% of snaps. It's not looking good for Hunter Henry. Jonnu Smith, on the other hand, who had a better week 1 overall at 6.3 fantasy points for the New England Patriots, also 0 fantasy points in week 2, 0 receptions off 3 targets. So there's no reason whatsoever moving into week 3 to consider starting a Patriots tight end. All right, Lions at Vikings. I do think that TJ Hawkinson is worth starting. I know his stat lines haven't been great, but he at least has 7 targets in each matchup so far this year. I like the game script for this game overall, but it is worth noting that Hawkinson is dealing with a hip injury, so keep an eye on that. But like I said, for most fantasy managers out there, if you have to start Hawkinson, not against it. It's not my favorite start, but at least the target share overall is there. Irv Smith, on the other hand, of the Minnesota Vikings, put together a nice week 2 after a goose egg in week 1. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a score. I do like Irv Smith as a start, or at least a stream, if you guys are in a position where you need to do so. I say you go ahead and you keep riding the hot hand. The main reason I have Hawkinson and Smith as starts is because, like I said, I like the game script. I like this divisional game. I like both teams involved. I think it's going to be a competitive game where each team is chasing points. So I think they're fine as starts, but you might want to tamper your expectations in terms of what type of ceiling you're going to get for the week. All right, Eagles at Commanders. This is another game, another good divisional game where I like the game script. So I've got Goddard and Thomas both as starters. I think that Goddard is looking pretty good overall. Had 13.2 fantasy points in week 2, 9 points in week 1, and that's in full PPR. But regardless, 6 targets in week 2, 5 receptions, 82 receiving yards. This Eagles offense looks good. I want pieces of it in my starting lineup. I love Goddard going into week 3. I've loved him since the offseason. I think he's going to have a very solid year overall. Logan Thomas, on the other hand, is making the most out of his opportunities now that he's fully healthy. 7.5 fantasy points in week 1, 12.7 in week 2, 5 targets, 3 receptions, 37 receiving yards, and a score. So yeah, he's gonna have better, stat lines overall when he scores. Most tight ends are, but I really like both these tight ends in this matchup. I do think both defenses will probably play pretty well, but I think that we'll still see enough offensive points in this game where you can definitely start Dallas Goedert and Logan Thomas moving into week 3. All right, Chiefs at Colts, you're starting Travis Kelce, no doubt about it. 26.1 fantasy points in week 1, 10.1 in week 2, at least 7 targets in each game this year, at least 50 receiving yards, and 1 score on the year. We really don't need to have any debate here. You're starting Travis Kelce, and on the flip side, you are not starting a Colts tight end whatsoever. There's nobody worth mentioning here. This offense looks really bad. This team is in shambles. The Chiefs are going to have a really good day. I hope that you are on the Travis Kelce side of things and not for some reason on the other side of things, considering starting a Colts tight end this week. So at the end of the day, that's all I got. Start Travis Kelce, sit Colts tight ends. Let's move on. All right, Texans at Bears. I've got the Texans tight ends as sits. There's no reason. Brevin Jordan is still dealing with an ankle injury. OJ Howard, after the big week 1 where he had the 2 touchdowns, puts up 1.7 points in week 2. And then Farrah Brown, nothing to see here either. 5.4 fantasy points in week 2, 2.7 in week 1. There's no reason whatsoever to start any Texans tight end, so they're all sits for me undoubtedly. Cole Kmet, on the other hand, is slapping fantasy managers all over the place, right in the face. All you guys out there who were in love with Kmet in the offseason. I mean, I liked Kmet in full PPR as maybe a nice late round steal, but gosh, for those of you guys who are high on him, he is just saying, screw you guys, I'm not going to be fantasy relevant, and I'm over exaggerating. It's not all Cole Kmet's fault. I get it, but he has 2 targets on the season and 0 receptions. He has 0 fantasy points on the season. He is tight end number 387 in full PPR according to Sleepers. So we'll keep Cole Kmet as a sit moving into week 3. Jaguars at Chargers. Okay, I've got Evan Engram as a sit. He's making some nice waves. I don't think he's the worst streaming option, but 6.8 fantasy points in week 1, 11.6 in week 2. I'm not quite sure if we have a large enough sample size for me to be confident moving forward with Evan Engram, but I will say if he plays well in this game, which should be a game where if the Jaguars can stay competitive, there's going to be a fair amount of points in this game. I will say if he can stay competitive in this game and put up a nice stat line, he's definitely going to be a tight end who is on my watch list. Looking forward, Jacksonville will have Philadelphia, Houston, Indy, the Giants, Denver, Las Vegas, and Kansas City before their bye week. A lot of interesting matchups coming up. So I would keep an eye on Evan Engram, but I think at the moment he's a sit for me unless you absolutely need a streaming option. You don't see anything better. I mean, he did have a pretty good day last Sunday, so we'll give him some props. Everett, on the other hand, of the Chargers, is a tight end I really like right now. He's a top waiver ad priority if he's still floating around for some reason. But let's face it, Justin Herbert and Gerald Everett have a really good chemistry going. Everett had 14.4 fantasy points in week 1, 13.1 in week 2, 10 targets in week 2 against Kansas City, most importantly, 71 receiving yards in week 2, 54 in week 1, and a score in week 1. So I really like where Everett is at this point in the season. It looks like in games where he had not scored, he's at least garnering the targets to give him a respectable fantasy stat line. He's got Jacksonville, Houston, Cleveland, Denver, Seattle coming up before his bye week. I think he's in a really good position to continue to be consistent, and I like him a lot in this matchup against the Jaguars moving into week 3. All right, Rams at Cardinals. HIGBEE is going to be a start for me. I really do like this matchup between the Rams and Cardinals. I think both tight ends are in a good position here. HIGBEE is sitting as your tight end 7 in full PPR at the moment. 11 targets in week 1, 9 in week 2. He had 7 receptions and 71 receiving yards against the Falcons for 14.1 fantasy points. He is definitely showing really good chemistry overall with quarterback Matthew Stafford. I like where HIGBEE is at this point in the season. Zach Ertz, on the other hand, is also showing out pretty well. Your tight end 5 in full PPR, 11 targets in week 2, 75 receiving yards, 15.5 fantasy points compared to 11.4 fantasy points in week 1. He does have a touchdown on the season, so I like where Ertz is at the moment. I like where HIGBEE is at. I like this game script. I like this matchup. HIGBEE and Ertz are both starts for me moving into week 3. All right, Packers at Bucks. I've got Robbie Tonyan as a sit at the moment. He was a tight end to watch for me going into week 2 after the Packers looked absolutely abysmal in week 1. He had 5 targets in week 1 and then just 2 in week 2, although the Packers played much better against Chicago. He's just too boomer bust for me. He's 1000% touchdown dependent, so I've got Tonyan as a sit. On the flip side, there's no reason whatsoever to start a single Buccaneers tight end. You're not starting Kyle Rudolph, who's not even active at the moment. Cameron Brate, on the other hand, has not put up more than 1.7 fantasy points in full PPR this season. Cade Otton hasn't put up more than 1.4 fantasy points, and Ko Kieft has put up 0 fantasy points. There's no reason for any of these players to be considered whatsoever moving into week 3. All right, Falcons at Seahawks. Oh man, Kyle Pitts, what are we going to do with you? What are we going to do if you own Kyle Pitts? Well, man, I hope you picked up Gerald Everett or Tyler Higbee or some other tight ends we've named tonight, because Kyle Pitts is just slapping fantasy managers around almost as bad as Cole Kmet in terms of draft value, probably worse than Cole Kmet. 3.9 fantasy points on the dot in both matchups so far this year. He has 4 total receptions off 10 targets. He has no more than 19 receiving yards in each game this year. What are we going to do with Kyle Pitts? I'm not sure. I sure as hell hope he starts to get more targets. I've got him as a sit moving in to week 3. The matchup is not awful against the Seahawks whatsoever, so I have an asterisk there. Maybe this is the week that Pitts gets back to true form, at least in terms of what we saw last year in terms of targets and receptions. I mean, I would really hope that the Falcons would start to involve him more. They absolutely should. We all know the talent that Kyle Pitts is. If you have been able to pick up a better option off waivers, Logan Thomas, Tyler HIGBEE, GERALD, EVERETT, whoever it may be, I think you roll with one of those players this week, and we sit back and we see what happens with Kyle Pitts, and we wait for a consistent stat line to emerge over the next couple of weeks. Am I panicking on Pitts? Not necessarily. Am I close? I'm pretty damn close, because a lot of you guys out there are at a point in your season where you need to start making some pivotal moves to win your fantasy matchups. And I know it hurts, but at the moment, Kyle Pitts is not very encouraging. Like I said, don't panic, don't drop him. If you're going to trade him, get good enough value. But at the moment, let's just sit back and see what happens. I've got him as a sit moving into week 3. On the other hand, I've got Noah Fant as a sit. A lot less drama here to talk about. I don't think anyone was really worried about if they were going to start Noah Fant or not this weekend. Nonetheless, he has no more than 6 targets on the season. He has not scored more than 4.6 fantasy points on the year, no more than 16 receiving yards in each of his 2 outings. So we'll go ahead and we'll leave Noah Fant of the Seattle Seahawks as a sit moving into week 3. All right, Niners at Broncos. I've got Kittle as a start if he plays. I mean, it's that simple. If he plays, he's a start. Same as last week. If he does not play, if he is not listed as healthy, then hopefully you have a better option that you've gotten off the waiver wires. You've been able to sit behind Kittle in the meantime. If you do own Kittle, you've already been used to this through weeks 1 and week 2. Obviously, if Kittle is healthy, he's a starter. And obviously, if you can't play him, then you're very bummed out and he's not starting. Albert O is a sit for me after having 6 targets in week 1, 5 receptions. I was pretty encouraged. I mean, not a crazy stat line, 8.3 fantasy points in week 1. But in week 2, only on the field for 53% of snaps, 2 targets, 0 receptions, 0 fantasy points. Eric Saubert for the Broncos had 9.2 fantasy points in week 2, but that's basically because he scored a touchdown, and that's really all there is to report on the Denver Broncos tight ends. It's not very encouraging, so I would leave Albert O as a sit moving into week 3. All right, Cowboys at Giants. Don't ask me why, but for some reason, instead of putting Dalton Schultz, I put Dallas Schultz on the screen. So give me a break. It is my second day back from COVID as I am filming this. Obviously, I have some COVID brain. Cowboys, Dallas, Dalton, Dallas. Go ahead and roast me in the comments down below. I have Dalton Schultz as a start if he plays, but there should be an asterisk here as well. Dalton Schultz is very iffy for Monday night, and he is playing on Monday night, so more than likely you're going to have to roll with one of these tight ends off of the waiver wire for the week, because we just can't afford to get to Monday Night Football 8:30 p.m. and Dalton Schultz is our only tight end that we're relying on to get us 6, 10, 12 fantasy points to win our matchup. You need to roll with someone off the waiver wire unless we get news that Dalton Schultz, aka Dallas Schultz, according to me, is on track to play. So there should be an asterisk on this screen, and I should know how to spell Dalton Schultz's name and know his name. This is the perfect way to end this video. On the other side of things, we are sitting the Giants tight ends. There is not a notable name. There's nobody to start on this roster for the Giants at the position. So you're sitting the Giants tight ends. We're keeping a close eye on Dalton Schultz moving into week 3. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, we put out free daily fantasy football content. We would love to help you dominate your fantasy football season. Feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Drops, ads, starts, sits, waiver wire, trades, quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, tight ends, defense, kickers, whatever it may be. Please let me know down below. I am happy to get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Make sure to check out all of our other uploads for the weeks, including our must-start kickers, must-start defenses, and all of our starts and sets, and come out to our next fantasy Q&A stream. We would love to have you. With that being said, I got nothing else to say, but thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you guys saw it here on the catch.